Ours is only $8 a day versus $7 a day. It's only $1 more. But look, the drop calls per million drop calls were only 400, and they're 6,000, right? So 4,000 to 6,000, right? Whatever the ratio is, and I was not doing the math in my head just now. But you want to emphasize what's best and minimize what's worst, and people will perceive those differences to be bigger or smaller because they don't get ratios. People are sheep, and you can influence them very easily with behavioral economics. Hey there, Guthrie here, talking about behavioral economics. Today's topic is subjective probability part 2. In case you should watch the previous video on overall subjective probability. Today's subjective probability has to do with expanding ranges. So again, subjective probability is just the idea that when I give you numbers and probability, most people don't actually think about it. Most people, they're not thinking about it in a math problem. They just kind of roll in this very kind of loosely, I'm part of the world, I'm thinking about things concretely, and as opposed to a ratio, which is this abstract figure. So the paper here is paper with the best name nominee is what I called it. It's by Bursa and Larek, called 6 of one, half dozen of the other. And it's basically about the weird human behavior that arises when people are confronted by ratios. So the biggest part of the ratio is when people compare two equal ratios as they scale. So people misjudge the value of proportional ratios. And here's an example to illustrate the point. So would you rather increase your score from 80 points to 100 or 4 points to 5? What sounds better to you? Now, again, the ratios are the same, and that was a pretty simple math problem. I bet you a lot of you were like, I can divide on that's something. That's a ratio we have to deal on a pretty regular basis because of time, dividing hours, and because of quarters, dividing money. But that said, a lot of people will pick the 80 to 100 because increasing 20 points is better than increasing 1. And I know in that case you may not believe me, but if you were introduced to it in a smart way in the study that they had, you definitely would do that. So in their study, and I'm not going to go through all of it because it's a little complicated, and it's better if you're curious, just read the blog post. Basically, they offered, for example, two phone plans, and they basically had the number of drop calls per 100 and the price per year, or the number of drop calls per 1,000 and the price per month, right? So in one case, you're going to have a very small, the number of drop calls per 100 might be 4.2, but the number of drop calls per 1,000 is going to be 42. Right, so 42 sounds, that's like a lot more drop calls, even though it's literally the exact same plan. So I'm just going to jump all the way down to the bottom line. So framing is important. And by the way, people did not pick evenly. People preferred the different plans based on how big the ratios were. So people will think that bigger numerical differences create a relatively bigger movement even when the ratio is exactly the same. Now, this is a tried and true marketing technique, and I don't think people maybe realize the research behind it, but think, for example, for $3 a day, you could have premium life insurance, which is what they use instead of for only $1,080 a year, you could have premium life insurance. The cost is the same, but using a smaller number with a larger interval makes it feel smaller. Now, the other classic example is just this TV, only 4 easy payments of $22.95, right? So this idea of taking a large chunk and breaking it down to make it feel smaller is very tried and true. That was study 1. Study 2, there's even more results. Again, I encourage you to read it. So I'm going to quote the paper's final conclusions here, okay? Quote, attribute expansion inflated the perceived difference between two alternatives on that attribute and thereby increased its weight relative to the other attributes. So here are the big takeaways. When you're comparing your product to the average competitor and your product is better than the average in a category, make that interval's time as big as possible to maximize the number and therefore the benefit. So the best example is I have student loans. I get companies saying, hey, you should consolidate your student loans. And they say, you could save $40,000 today. Now that's because the number is huge, but that's because the number is based on an early payoff of paying 10 years with with less interest than the 30-year extended rate payoff, right? So they've stretched their number. Instead of saying, hey, you could save $1 a day or right? They've stretched it out and they've made the best possible terms to get that $40,000 number that you could save, which sounds so huge. So again, when you're comparing your product to the average and your product is better in a category, emphasize, you want to combine the chunk into as big as possible so it can make your benefit look huge, look massive. You can save $50,000. You can save $100 off your milk buying or something, right? Even though it's actually a lot of tiny little changes over a long course of time. But on the flip side, if you or your customers comparing your product to the average and your product is worse in a category, make that interval of time as small as possible to minimize the number and therefore negate the magnitude of difference. So for example, let's say your product costs $2,880 a year and your competitor's product is $2,520, right? So you don't want to say our product costs only $300 more a year than our competitor, which sounds like a lot. I'm like, well, I'm not going to pay that. But what you should say instead is the competitor, yeah, they're $7 a day, but they don't have any features. We're $8 a day, only $1 extra, and look at all these other features we get, right? So instead of stretching the time to magnify the difference, you've minimized the time to minimize the difference. So even though, by the way, 2,880 and 2,520, that's the same ratio as $7 a day to $8 a day. It doesn't matter, right? The $8 a day, it's only $1 more. It feels like it's less. So we're going to talk about segmentation later, but these are a great example of how you can use framing and segmentation to influence people, to use behavioral economics to make them feel differently. So the best, really what you want to do is you can mix and match these. And that's exactly what they did in their study. And again, I'm not going to get too much into it, right? But they had the price. They had two competitors, right? Plan A, Plan B. And one had the price and one had the number of dropped calls, right? So they had a higher quality one that was more expensive but had fewer dropped calls, and then they had the lower quality one that was cheaper and had more dropped calls. And so what you want to do is if you are the cheaper company, you want to make the dropped calls number, as tiny as possible, right? Maybe make it per 10 calls, right? So it's like, okay, they have 0.6 drop calls per every 10, but we only have 0.4. But then you make the price huge, right? Oh, over a 10-year period, you could save $20,000, right? So and then if you're the expensive competitor, you do just the opposite, right? Ours is only $8 a day versus $7 a day. It's only $1 more. But look, the drop calls per million drop calls were only 400, and they're 6,000, right? So 4,000 to 6,000, right? Whatever the ratio is, and I was not doing the math in my head just now. But you want to emphasize what's best and minimize what's worst. And people will perceive those differences to be bigger or smaller because they don't get ratios. People are sheep, and you can influence them very easily with behavioral economics. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Blog post, whatever you want to call it, video. And you can definitely subscribe, and you should also go read the original paper. Thank you so much.